So the topic today is Property Theory 101. It's essentially the first 4 chapters in my book, Property and Contract in Economics, The Case for Economic Democracy. And just going to try to go over the basic arguments in not too much detail, but try to get through all the arguments in something under an hour and some of the sort of typical questions that people ask. So the basic question here is we're looking at the economy at the firm level. So we're going to ask the question of property is, how is it that one party, one legal party rather than another, owns the product of the firm? And you then look at how people ordinarily answer that question, what's wrong with the ordinary answers, and then you reformulate it. So if you ask that question to any normal person today, how is it that one person or one party rather than another owns the product of the firm? They'll say, well, of course, the owner of the firm. So you have this idea that there's such a thing as the owner of a firm. And the more, one of the other traditional ways to say it was the owner of the means production. And so a lot of people even characterize the system by this idea that there is an owner of the means production that determines who owns the product, that determines the management rights, and everything about the firm. So the first thing to get around is to see in what sense that's actually false. And the one way to approach that is to go back to the old idea in the Middle Ages that the ruler of a certain territory or a certain piece of land was the owner of the land. So you had this whole idea that owning land automatically gives you governance rights over the people that live on the land. And this was all sort of rolled together. As one legal scholar put it, ownership and rulership are blended together. And that same idea is then carried over to the capitalist economy, where capital plays that role. And in fact, that's where the name capitalism came from, is that owning the capital, owning the means production is supposed to have this unique property that it gives you the right to the product, and it gives you the management rights over the production process. But the way to separate these two rights is to just take into account the fact that capital is rentable. And it would also be separated in the Middle Ages if there had been a market in land. Because once you have a market in land, so land can be leased or rented out, then you have one person using the land. And just as a farmer may be working on leased land, the farmer will own the product, and yet he doesn't own the land. So the ownership of the land doesn't automatically carry with it the ownership of the product. It depends on whether it's worked, say, by the owner, or it's leased out to somebody else who then works the land. So the ownership of the product isn't determined by the ownership of the means production, because capital is rentable too, and land is rentable, buildings are rentable, capital assets are rentable, structures, whatever you want, whatever durable inputs you have in production, they're called capital, are rentable. And then the owner of the capital is not the party undertaking the production process using that capital. So in that sense, the owner of the capital is not the firm. So what do people mean when they say the ownership of the firm? Well, what they really mean is this party has a certain contractual role, that they're the ones that buy all the inputs, and they bear the cost of those inputs as the production process goes on, and then they have this claim on the output because they paid all the cost. And they may not be the people that own the land at all. They may not be the people that own the buildings. They may not own the machinery even. The machinery can also be leased. And so what is really identified with the firm is this nexus of contracts, it's called sometimes, this pattern of the contracts where you are the one that has either already owns or rents, buys the services of all the other inputs in production, as well as all the intermediate goods that are needed, or the raw materials and the energy and so forth. I mean, all what economists call the inputs to production. And if you bear all those costs, then you're the one that has the undivided claim on whatever is produced. So it's not, so this pattern of contracts cannot be owned. And that's why this whole notion of ownership of the firm or ownership of the means production is automatically including the product and the management rights is a conceptual mistake, that it's really a pattern of contracts that makes one a firm, that makes one a residual claimant in a market economy. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to analyze how, in fact, the market economy works, and then look at it from the normity question. Say, well, how should it work, or how should the ownership of the product be determined? So the basic idea then is the traditional answer, ownership of the means production or ownership of the firm, doesn't cut it. It doesn't. It's really the pattern of contracts that counts. And when people say ownership of the firm, sometimes they mean simply the ownership of the corporation, which is a very real ownership. But the corporation isn't exactly the same position. It could lease out its capital to somebody else, or lease out its lands or buildings, and would not be the firm. It would not be the residual claimant in the production process using those lands or buildings or machines. I mean, a simple example is you go shopping in a mall, and you have all these different stores, and each store has a different operator that has a residual claimant in the store, but they don't own the means production. It's owned by the mall corporation. So the mall corporation is in the business of leasing out this the shop space to the various companies or entrepreneurs that are leasing that space, and then buying the materials and selling something there. So in each and every case, it's the pattern of the contracts that counts, and not some prior property right called the ownership of the firm. And the ownership of a corporation is just an indirect way to own the land or the buildings or the capital, and the same thing holds, that the owners of the mall corporation are not the owners of the, or they're not the residual claimants in all the stores inside that mall. So so we have to reframe the question, and the original question, ownership of the product, isn't decided by somebody saying, oh, well, they own the firm or they own the means production. We have to look at the contracts, and we see that the way it is decided in a market economy is by that pattern of contracts. So that's the wisdom number one, is this sort of reframing of this question. Just to give you an example, just today I was reading a review of a book put out by Alan Meltzer, who's a professor emeritus at Carnegie Mellon, fairly famous professor in right-wing circles, and he just published a book in his elder years called Why Capitalism? And so the interesting thing is, well, how does he define capitalism? And he defines it as private ownership of the means production, protection of property rights, and rule of law. So he obviously believes that if you have ownership of means production, that decides everything. And he doesn't realize that the determination of who is the firm is determined by the contracts. So so that's sort of point number one. And when you then look at the contracts, then you have to say, well, what is the characteristic of the system? What is it that defines capitalism if it's not the private ownership of capital? And you could have a economy entirely of cooperatives or worker-owned companies, and you'd still have private ownership of the means production, but that would not determine who's running the firms, who are the members of the firms, because the capital, even if it's owned by the people in the firm, is in effect rented by the firm, by the cooperative, or by the worker-owned company. So I don't think Alan Meltzer or anybody else would call that a capitalist economy in the original sense. So what is really characteristic of the capitalist economy is the fact that you have a employer-employee relationship, that the people in the firm are not working for themselves, and that they are purchased by this either corporation or individual who plays the role of the employer. And so just to sort of stop then and re-look at the question, we have a system where people like Alan Meltzer or ordinary economists will spend their whole lives studying the system and don't even know what is the characteristic feature of the system. That the characteristic feature, I mean, if you spent your whole life living in a slave society, say, and at the end of your life you wrote your book and apologizing for the system, and you said, well, the characteristic of the system is private ownership of. Anika, your mic is on.
It is.
Yes, yes. Okay. So somebody spent their whole life studying the slavery system, and then at the end of it said the characteristic feature of the system was the private ownership of cotton farms. Then you would say, my God, how can you live your whole life in a system based on buying and owning other people and not even see that that's the characteristic of the system? Yet that's the typical situation that economists like Meltzer go through their whole lives studying the system and don't even realize that the basic institution of the system is the renting of people or the hiring of people or the employment relationship, the employer-employee relationship. So we have gone from a system of owning the workers and to a system of renting the workers and doing it voluntarily. And it's been so well covered by ideology, thick sauce of ideology, that you have economists don't even recognize that as the characteristic of the system. So there is a certain, just give you an example of this out of the book. There's this famous professor that studied worker self-management and participatory democracy in her youth at professor of political science at UCLA, Carol Pateman, and she was just recently the president of the American Political Science Association, a very high level, just like Robert Dahl was in the past, another supporter of workplace democracy. And in one of her articles, the epitaph of the article was a quote from the Property and Contract book, and here's the quote: democracy is at war with the renting of human beings, not with private property. So as a political scientist, she was looking at it in terms of democracy, and said that the problem is not private property, because this ownership of the means production, ownership of the firm, isn't actually a real property right at all. What the real basis of the system is the renting of the people in the firm, and that's why democracy is at war with the renting of human beings, not with private property. And just to finish that paragraph, which is on page 19 of the book, in the mythical picture painted by capitalist ideology, private property rights are the center of the universe. Our analysis shows that the actual center of the capitalist universe is the employment contract. The economic application democratic theory and the labor theory of property, which is what we're talking about today, presented here, is based on the Copernican paradigm shift of seeing capitalism as revolving around the employment contract instead of revolving around private ownership of the means production. So just to explain what the labor theory of property is about, you've got to start with this whole prolegomena, this whole preface of reframing the question and saying that the way the question is usually answered by saying, oh, well, they own the means of production, they own the firm, that settles everything, is a false analysis in a market economy. And it's not a normative critique, it's simply a factual critique of what determines who is the firm or who is the residual claimant. So we've got that, and then the question is, well, let's reformulate a little bit this basic question, because we see the way it actually operates is that some party ends up, as a result of the contracts they make, owning all the inputs, which means the services of the land, labor, and capital, and owning the intermediate goods or the raw materials and the energy and everything that is used, and then they bear those costs. And in other words, all those things are used up in the process of production, and then you produce a product. And it's conceptually better to formulate this question of not just the ownership of the product, but also the ownership of the liabilities that are created. So all those costs are liabilities in the accounting sense. And the whole process of production is not producing the product ex nihilo. It's producing the product by using up all these inputs. Use economist terms of inputs and outputs. So you can think of creating all these liabilities, using up the inputs as a negative product, and then the output that you tend to produce by using that is the positive product. And you put the two together, and you have this bundle of negative things, the liabilities, and the positive things, your outputs. And the name I would suggest for that is the whole product. So the whole product is a technical term that doesn't just mean all the outputs, it means all the outputs and the liabilities. So we know in a market system that that person that gets the whole product is the residual claimant, is the party that makes those contracts. Then we have to step back and say, okay, that's the answer to the factual question. The descriptive question of who gets the whole product, who is the firm. I mean, that's just another name for who is the firm, is who gets the whole product, who bears those liabilities and owns the product, the positive product. Who should it be? Who ought to be the one that bears those costs and that owns the product? So that's the normative question. And then you have to look at the system as it is and say, once you have an answer to the normative question, is there something wrong, structurally wrong with the existing system if they end up being different parties? So the way I would approach the normative question is what is traditionally called the labor theory of property or the natural rights theory of property. But the key to understand what that historical theory is about is it's simply the normal notion of imputing responsibility, that the whole legal system runs off the idea that you try to find who is in fact responsible for something, and then you assign to them the legal responsibility. That's what a trial is about. You have a person charged with a certain crime, and you, if the jury decides on the question of fact that the person is in fact responsible for that crime as charged, then the legal system assigns the legal liability. As they say, they impute the legal liability to them for that crime. So the principle is simply that legal responsibility is supposed to be assigned according to factual responsibility. And when there's a mismatch, then you have a miscarriage of justice. You have an injustice occurring. And so a mismatch can occur two ways. You can have the person who's not in fact responsible for the crime, nevertheless being convicted. There's being legally responsible but not factually responsible. And you can have a mismatch the other way, where the person who is in fact responsible for the crime is not held legally responsible. So anytime you get factual responsibility not matching legal responsibility, then that's the basic idea of an injustice, of a miscarriage of justice, where the two notions of responsibility are not aligned. So, and you know, a typical example of this is of course, we could take an employer-employee relationship where the employer instructs the employee to, in their cooperative work together, to commit a crime, to rob a bank, or it can be a hired killer, and then they're both caught, and they go before the judge, and the hired criminal says, "Well, look, I was just hired. I mean, I was not part of this whole joint venture, and I'm just a hired hand. I do my job. I get paid. I'm not responsible for anything." And the judge would rather be unmoved by this, and would say, "Well, look, you're two human beings cooperating together, and yes, he paid you to do this, and that's simply another reason, gave you a reason to do it, but you did it knowing what you were doing. You did it as a responsible human being, and you are both considered liable." So the court, when it looks at the actual behavior of the responsible human beings, even though they're legally had gone through the motion of an employer-employee contract, the judge and the legal system treats them as partners, as two or more responsible human beings who cooperate together to do this venture, and you're all factually responsible for it, and you will all be held legally responsible for it. Then you take the same insight and you go over to a normal production process, and you notice that people don't suddenly become robots or some sort of a instrument, non-responsible instrument, when their actions are legal. So when the employees work together with the employer at the employer's behest, if we're thinking of a working employer, to produce the product by using up all the inputs, then you have exactly the same factual situation. Nothing has changed in the factual situation. There's no longer a crime involved, but we're not talking about how the law reacts. We're talking about, first of all, the factual situation is that a bunch of human beings cooperated together. They used up all the inputs, so they were in fact factually responsible for producing the negative product. And in the course of doing all that, they produce the positive product, whatever the outputs are. So they're factually responsible for the positive product, and you put the two together, they are factually responsible for the whole product, for producing the liabilities as well as the assets that are created in this production process. And then you say, okay, so that's the factual situation. Let's now look at the legal situation. And we just saw what the legal situation was. The legal situation was that one party, only the employer, bought all the inputs, and in this case, including the labor of the employees, as well as the other services and machines and land and buildings and energy and raw materials and all that, and bears those costs. So the legal liability for the negative product is borne solely by the employer, and the ownership of the product, the positive product that's produced, is borne solely by the employer. So the employer has the legal ownership of the whole product, legally appropriates the whole product, as we say. So here you have a situation where we just saw that the factual responsibility was to all the human beings that actively cooperate in this process in the firm, in the enterprise, and the legal responsibility is only to the employer. So here is another example then of a mismatch between the legal responsibility and the factual responsibility. Same sort of mismatch that we would call a miscarriage of justice if it happened in the criminal justice system or in the system of torts. But it happens in a case where there are no crimes or torts committed. So there's no reason for judges to intervene and to look at who is in fact responsible. So all the rules here is the way the contracts are made. And you've got this special contract called the master-servant contract, the employer-employee contract, the contract to rent human beings, which pretends as if responsibility could be alienated from the employees to the employer, and thus the employer, if responsibility could in fact be alienated, would be the one that's solely factually responsible, and thus it would be correct for the employee to be solely legally responsible. But we've seen, as in the case of the hired criminal, that factual responsibility cannot be alienated. When you sign a contract, you don't suddenly become a robot or a non-responsible instrument. So you get this mismatch then between the factual and legal responsibility in the firm, any firm that operates on the basis of the employment contract. And we see what goes wrong in the whole system of contracts. Namely, there is this one contract renting of a human being, which pretends, as it were, that responsibility can be alienated, and factual responsibility, that we can somehow turn ourselves into a rented thing by signing this contract. And we see from the hired criminal example that of course people don't do that in fact. Regardless of the legality of the contract, we're talking about the facts. Do people in fact become some kind of instrument when their actions are legal, but suddenly burst into responsible agency when their actions are illegal? No, I mean, they're the same people. And there's the same sort of cooperation with the employer and with each other in this whole process. So that is the critique. That is the judgment of injustice, of a mismatch between the two, legal and factual responsibility, miscarriage of justice in the firm that operates on the basis of the employment contract, which is what was traditionally called a capitalist firm. And so point one is to understand the argument, and number two is to see that it has nothing to do with the size of the wage. That you could pay the workers $1,000 an hour, and it has no bearing on this fact about the inalienability of responsibility, the fact that the people in the firm are still jointly responsible for both the negative product and the positive product, which is solely legally appropriated by the employer. And so when it comes to one of the historical names for this responsibility principle is the labor theory of property. Labor theory of property is just the responsibility principle applied to questions of property. And once you do that, then it gets confused very quickly with the labor theory of value, which is quite a different theory, and which was developed by Marx and others into a theory of exploitation, which basically boiled down to saying that the workers are paid too little for their work. It's an underpayment theory of exploitation, that more labor time is extracted from them than is paid for, and therefore workers are exploited. So the labor theory of property has nothing to do with these questions of value. It's not an exploitation theory. It has nothing to do with the size of the wage rate at all, and has solely to do with the fact that you have human beings being rented as things, and thus pretending that responsibility can be evaded, whereas in fact it wasn't, and therefore you have a mismatch between the actual responsibility in production and the legal consequences that play out in the realm of contracts when this contract is validated by the law. The same contract that, of course, the law recognizes being completely invalid and ignores when they commit a crime. Then it says, the judge says, I don't see employer-employee, I see two people engaged in a joint venture, carrying out a criminous venture, and you'll both be held responsible. And so in some sense, we're saying that workers should always be treated as criminals. In other words, they should always be treated as responsible human beings, and even when they don't commit crimes. And so that production would always be organized in this sort of a partnership of all that work in the firm, and regardless of what they're paid. And that sort of a firm is what we're talking about. We called a labor managed firm or a democratic firm or workplace democracy or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of different names, but this is sort of the basic idea in the firm. Now, in one of the earlier sessions, one of our folks asked this question. Tony asked a question. So let's be concrete. Let's take a real specific example and what's wrong with it. So the example was that Tony says, okay, I like pies and I like to sell them. And so I'm going to pay one of my friends to make some pies. So I will provide the stove and the apples and the dough and the pie pans and all that. And my friend will make pies. And I will pay him $5 a pie, say, and then which Tony will then resell whatever they are on the market, say $8 or $10 or something. And so what's wrong with that? I mean, that seems to be a perfectly normal contract, and where is there any sort of a fraud or mismatch and so forth? So then we go and we analyze this contract. Well, first of all, notice that he's not buying the pies from his friend. That the friend, see, the friend could be in an independent business where he pays Tony rent on the stove, buys the dough wherever he wants to buy it, maybe from Tony, somebody else, buys the pie pans, the apples, and so forth, and then produces the pies. Then the friend would own the pie because the friend had borne all those costs. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a situation where Tony owns all that and then pays his friend per pie. So what's really going on there is that the friend doesn't own the pie because he didn't pay any of the costs, didn't own any of the inputs and bear those liabilities. So he doesn't own the product that is produced, the pies. And he's basically being paid a wage rate, but the wage rate in this case is calculated as a piece rate, and the pieces are the pies. So this is still an employment relationship, and even though Tony may not oversee the work in any great detail or anything, but it's still an employment relationship where he's paying for the labor in a labor contract and not paying for pies in a pie contract because the friend doesn't own the pies. And then you can analyze the same thing in terms of responsibility, that who is in fact liable for using up the services of the oven and the apples and the dough and the pie pans and so forth, and that is the friend. and who is it, in fact, de facto responsible for producing the pie is also the friend, and Tony, by assumption, had no direct part in the process, and so you have the one party being de facto responsible for producing the negative product and the positive product, and yet it's all legally appropriated by Tony. And one of the costs that Tony covers is this wage rate paid to his friend on a piece rate basis. So that's an example of what looks in the beginning like a perfectly normal contract, and yet you see behind the scenes that there is this, again, this mismatch where the friend is in effect operating this bubble that they're not responsible for using up all these inputs, and they're not responsible for what they produce. They're simply paid for their labor as if labor were some sort of a transferable service, like I'm renting a car, I'm renting a house, something like that. All these, the services of things, of durable objects, are transferable between persons, but the services of persons, in other words, the actions of persons, the responsible, deliberate actions of persons, are not responsible, are not transferable between people, as we see so clearly in the hard criminal case. So that was the sort of the example that Tony brought up, and the treatment analysis of it using the labor theory of property. What is the reaction? What sort of alternative ways of looking at production have come out of neoclassical economics? And one of them is a very sophisticated theory called marginal productivity theory, and what they do there is to essentially treat all factors as if they were responsible, because one of the peculiarities here is that only human beings can be responsible for anything, and human beings need other inputs in order to produce, but that's because the other inputs are causally efficacious. You cannot charge a crime to an instrument, or an instrument cannot be responsible, but it certainly can be causally efficacious. And we're right in the middle of a gun control debate now, and the facts are that only people can be responsible for murder or for shooting, but it's certainly facilitated if you have guns, and so even though the guns themselves cannot be responsible, they are certainly very causally efficacious. And if there were less guns around, then there would be less killing. But in any case, the question of responsibility is very clear, that only human beings can be responsible, that things cannot be held responsible for anything. So one of the tricks in the neoclassical theory of marginal productivity theory is, we'll say all factors are productive. So let's not talk about responsibility, let's talk about productivity. And this actually played out in one of the creators of marginal productivity theory, which was Friedrich von Wieser, an Austrian economist at the turn of the century, and wrote a book called Social Value. And he was the one that, he was originally trained as a lawyer, and he was the one that introduced this whole responsibility interpretation into marginal productivity theory as he developed marginal productivity theory itself. So the idea was that he wanted to say that each factor was responsible for part of the product. And then you had to look at the question, well, in the end, does that factor get that portion of the product or not? And surprisingly, von Wieser says, well, if we are thinking of ordinary legal or moral responsibility, then only labor can be named, that capital is a dead tool in the hands of man, and only labor, only persons can be responsible for anything. So von Wieser admitted explicitly, and I quote this in the book, that if you use the ordinary notion of responsibility, then only labor can be named, and he in effect derived right then the labor theory of property, that only labor should have the legal responsibility for the negative product as well as the positive product. In other words, labor should be the firm. But that wasn't the conclusion he wanted. That's not his job. to criticize the system and to suggest some alternative system. He needs to account for the system as it exists, and so he says, well, obviously the notions of legal and moral responsibility are not relevant. We need a new notion. We need a notion of economic responsibility, and so that's then the role of marginal productivity theory. So the idea then is you try to reconceptualize the causal efficaciousness at the margin of all inputs, things as well as persons, as if it were a type of responsibility, and then you see, okay, did you get what you were responsible for? What was your share of the product? And at the same time as von Wieser was making this interpretation in the United States, John Bates Clark was inventing the same theory, and essentially inventing the same interpretation, but he was talking in more not in terms of responsibility, but in terms of getting the fruits of your labor, and or getting, in other words, as he put it a little more abstractly, getting what you create, and then slowly the language slips over what you or your instruments create, and so it boils down then to looking at the marginal productivity of the instruments of capital and machinery and so forth, and the marginal productivity of people, and seeing what they're paid, and you can show in a long-term competitive equilibrium with zero peer profits that each provider of an input is paid the marginal productivity, the value of the marginal productivity of that input, and thus that settles the whole question in their minds of property. And so it's a very nice theory, but of course they're not talking about property at all. That's not even the ownership of the product. The product isn't owned partly by the suppliers of labor, and partly by the suppliers of machinery, and partly by the suppliers of the land. So the product is owned all by one party, and that's the residual claimant, the firm, and the liabilities as well. So all that the marginal productivity theory ended up being was a theory about the pricing of those inputs, the pricing of the liabilities, and that each input should be priced according to its marginal productivity, and that's a perfectly good notion if it is an input that should be just an input. In other words, not a human being, but a thing used in production. And in a worker managed firm or cooperative, it would be perfectly rational to buy your inputs up to the point where the value of their marginal product is equal to the price of the input. And if you deviate from that on either side, you will be in effect throwing away money. And so it's a perfectly good principle. It has nothing to do with property rights at all. And of course that's evident anyway, since it has nothing to do with actual responsibility. It has to do with this causal efficaciousness at the margin of all inputs, human or non-human, into the production process. And certainly non-human inputs are very efficacious, and so the whole question of pricing them and how much to demand of them is a very valid question, and the marginal productivity theory is a very good answer to that question, and would be used for non-human inputs in a labor managed firm. So that was one approach to this whole issue, to try to reformulate the question in terms of this distribution of the product to the input suppliers, and by treating each input as if it were some sort of a responsible factor, and not addressing at all the actual structure of property rights that General Motors plant, the workers don't own some of the cars, and the suppliers of the power or the suppliers of the intermediate goods don't own some of the other cars. I mean, it's all owned by one party, and that's so when you deal with property rights, you have to deal with the actual property rights that exist, not some sort of a metaphorical picture that ends up really being a story about pricing, the demand for inputs. So on the demand side, another way to look at all this is, rather than look at all the inputs as if they're responsible, is look at none of them as if they're responsible, and to sort of conceptualize the whole production process as simply a technological transformation. And that you will also see in a lot of books, is that particularly more mathematically formulated treatments is given these inputs, these are the outputs. And so the whole process of production is not a human activity. It's not seen as a human activity. It's seen as some sort of a transformation of inputs into outputs. And this is even used in the context of the owner of the firm. Somebody owns this transformation. No such property right exists, and but that's often the formulation, and that also avoids the actual question of responsibility, because nobody's responsible. The humans are just part of the inputs. The other materials are part of the inputs, and technology transforms the inputs into the outputs, and that's usually represented by a production function or a production set in mathematically formulated economic theory. So the standard theory to account for the system, or apologize for the system, avoids the whole question of responsibility, because once you raise the question of responsibility, all the alarm bells go off, because people know that only humans can be responsible, and they don't want to get into a discussion about the firm, recognizing that only the workers and the managers, everybody in the firm, are the only responsible party. They want to reframe the question in some entirely different way, treating everything as responsible, just identifying responsibility with causal efficaciousness at the margin, as in marginal productivity theory, or in the sort of just strictly technological interpretation. There is no responsibility. It's just a technological process that takes place, like a natural process of one thing turning into another, where there's no human agents, so the inputs are turned into the outputs, and nobody does it. So one way or the other, when you're trained in economics, you'll be trained not to ask the question of responsibility, and to look at it using one metaphor or the other metaphor, just so you don't raise the wrong sort of questions, because then the answers become obvious and they're not the answers that people are looking for. So that's sort of carries us through the theory. The labor theory of property has a history, and so to some extent, people also need to be aware of that history. And remember, we have these two ways to formulate it: to the labor theory of property and the responsibility principle. And the responsibility principle is, in fact, the sort of the key to the modern treatment of the labor theory of property. It's sort of been there all along, but underneath it wasn't brought out very explicitly. And once you formulate in terms of responsibility, then it's clear only labor can be only actions of human beings can be responsible, and it's clear that it's not alienable, that this is not something you can transfer, like the services of renting a car, or renting a house, or renting land, or renting a tool. That the responsibility of human beings have is something that they have as long as they're acting as normal human beings, so they're not turned into some sort of robot. So that theory, when you say what is its history, then you have to say, well, which version? If you think of it as the responsibility principle, then the theory is ancient. I mean, I don't know when in human history the legal systems operated on a different basis. Maybe you would say, if you went back maybe to animism, where people were just driven by some sort of a bad spirit, and they were not responsible. But for any sort of written history, that's the way the legal system has always operated, is on that basis. And so, by the way, it's a perfectly bourgeois, to use a favorite word of denigration by Marxists, it's a perfectly bourgeois principle. There's nothing radical about the idea of holding people responsible for the results of their actions. And then you translate that ancient idea over into property language. It's giving people ownership of the fruits of their labor. Rather than results of their actions, you say fruits of their labor. And we saw also that fruits are positive and negative, that you have the negative fruits, or the liabilities for what you use up. Production is not out of nothing. You've got to use up all these inputs, and you produce an output, which are the positive fruits, and together it's the whole product that people working in an enterprise are, in fact, responsible for. So in that property formulation, it's usually traced back to John Locke, who wrote in the 17th century, and to his two treatises on government, the second treatise. And here we have some problems of interpretation, because people will attribute the labor theory of property to Locke, yet when you get inside Locke's head, as it were, you see that actually he gave a very peculiar version of it, and which was in fact quite compatible with the employment relationship. So you've got to separate the two. Some people refer to the Lockean theory, and they mean basically the idea that people should get the fruits of their labor, positive and negative. But Locke himself said, well, the idea is that you go back to somebody working on the commons, and God has given them the ownership of themselves and of their labor, and when they mix their labor with the commons, then they have established their property right to the result. And so this could be anywhere from the improved land to the fruit of agriculture and so forth. And there was always this what's called the Lockean proviso, as long as enough is left over for everybody else to have an equal claim. So you might say, well, this is like the theory of homesteading, that you work a certain portion of land, and everyone else has an equal claim to other portions of land, and so you stake out your land and you work the land, you till it, you improve it, you plant trees, you do whatever, and therefore you get the ownership of the land. So that was the basic idea. That was sort of the moral intuition behind Locke's theory, that having mixed my labor with it has established my claim to it. And so the way this got twisted around then was that he then has this famous phrase where he says that the turfs, in other words, the bits of grass that my servant has cut out of the common, hath mixed, since my labor has been mixed with it, then it becomes my turfs. And so then you suddenly realize that what Locke is now calling my labor is labor that he owns, not the labor that he performs, but labor that he owns because he bought it from the servant. And that gives a whole new meaning to the specific Lockean form of this theory, that's treating labor as if that's something that could be transferred, and so when Locke says the labor that was my own hath removed it out of the commons, meaning the grass that his servant has cut, then you realize he's treating labor as something that's alienable, and that the servant, as it were, is like an instrument that he is using. So it's the employer's labor that removes it out of the commons using this instrument, which was his servant, something like that. Or otherwise it's just a pun to call it my labor when it's the labor that performed by the servant. So there you have these two interpretations, the sort of labor theory of property interpretation of Locke, and this very peculiar way in which Locke actually, when you read him carefully, expressed the theory. And the modern writer C.B. Macpherson, a Canadian political scientist, wrote on political theory quite a bit. He was one of the few that was quite careful in saying, well, the Lockean theory is really quite compatible with wage labor, because the way Locke interpreted it was that the fruits of my labor means the labor I own, not the labor I perform, whereas most people in the history of thought interpreted Locke as saying the labor that I perform, which is the labor theory of property then, and then the labor that the servant performs would establish the servant's property right in it. So
Dave, where did Macpherson make that distinction about?
Yeah, it's his book called The Theory of Possessive Individualism.
Okay, yep.
It's one of his best books. So, and you know, it's been since filtered through the philosophical literature and all that. So it's no longer a great discovery that Locke had this other peculiar interpretation of my labor. But you know, that is really filtered into ordinary speech. I mean, you have the owners of a corporation or even a small business that has a lot of workers in it, and people say, I did this or I did that, and it's all as if the people that were employed are instruments and in your hands, and you are, even the language says that, the language of employer, I employ these people to do something, so I'm doing it, and they are simply the employees, they are simply the rented instruments of my labor, of my activity, my entrepreneurial activity to produce something. So they're called manufacturers, even though they never get close to a factory. They're called producers, even though they don't actually produce anything. And so the Lockean pun or the Lockean metaphor is actually also part of the common language, and was probably very natural for Locke to use. I mean, I don't want to impute any nefarious purpose to him. He was simply, that's the way people think about using a servant or using employees in the master-servant relationship. So that's the treatment of Locke. And so, yes, in one sense, the labor theory of property is Lockean theory in the sense that that's the way Locke was usually read, although when you do the exegesis a little more carefully, you see that Locke had a peculiar twist on it that made it compatible.
Brent, you may have this kind of gets into the sort of chronology business. So that was how Locke kind of dissembled on this stuff, and he was well before any of the classical laborists or whatever, right? I mean, I'm just trying to get the chronology straight.
Right. The classical laborists, which in the history of this business are called Ricardian socialists, even though that's they're neither Ricardian nor socialist in the more traditional sense. But these are people like Thomas Hodgkin in England, or William Thompson in England, and in France, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. All use the labor theory of property. Hodgkin is perhaps the most interesting one because he referred back to Locke, taking Locke as the labor theory of property, not paying any attention to the Lockean twist on it, and all these people were writing explicitly about property. Because this was the train of thought that was dealt with as a theory of value in Adam Smith and in Ricardo, the labor theory of value, and then Hodgkin and Proudhon used a sort of labor theory. But they were quite explicit. They were using it as a theory of property. I mean, the very name of Proudhon's book was What is Property? Not what is value, but what is property? And the name of Hodgkin's main book was called The Natural versus the Artificial Right of Property. And talking about the natural right of property of those that produce the product, and the artificial right of property of those that end up legally appropriating it because of the employment contract. And being a violation of the Lockean principle that people should get the fruits of their labor. Now, I'm not saying you won't find in Hodgkin or in Proudhon other statements about value, because the ideas were all sort of mushed together in those days. But and this was the early 1800s. This was way after Locke, which was in the 1600s. So the main event that happened after that, it was, of course, Marx's writing. And Marx was a much more powerful intellectual and had a much more indelible print on intellectual history. So these people are sort of seen as minor precursors to Marx. And Marx didn't use the labor theory of property quite explicitly. He was quite critical of Proudhon and all that, dismissing these bourgeois notions about the justified form of private property. And Marx used the labor theory of value and tried to build his whole theory based on the labor theory of value, trying to make sense out of it in his own peculiar way, and then turn it into a theory of exploitation.
But isn't the strange thing, again, and we've sort of been around on this, is that he seemed to be the inventor of the labor theory of value, and you're saying it was Adam Smith was the inventor of labor
Oh
theory
yeah,
of
oh
value.
yeah. I mean, you can go way back into the scholastics. I mean, the ideas are very old, and but in terms of if you the sort of elevator version of a history of economic thought usually starts with Adam Smith. There's plenty of people before Smith that had the idea of the labor theory of value, or the even Smith. I mean, look at the form it took in Smith. It's basically once again this Lockean picture of people operating on nature, operating on the commons, and so he says that the value of a beaver will be in proportion to the value of a deer as the amount of labor needs to be expended in order to catch a beaver versus catching a deer. So what the assumption there is there are no other inputs. That the we're operating in the commons, we're running through the woods and trying to catch a deer or trying to trap a beaver, and so if the only input is labor, then you can be pretty sure that something like the labor theory of value will hold. And even Smith abandoned it as he then moved away from this primitive state of nature and brought in capital. Capital meaning produced means production, machinery, buildings, improved land, and so forth. So, and then that was the real development as a serious theory was Ricardo, and Marx really thought he was going to take them on and scientifically develop the theory out of Ricardo, and then show that in fact it was a theory of exploitation as well. And that's what has been answered over the decades, and the sort of final answer came at the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, in the development of marginal productivity theory. That was the final answer to cover the supply or the demand for inputs, supply of inputs coming from whoever has these inputs, and then on the consumer side, you had the customers giving you the demand for outputs, and you had the firms giving you the supply curve for outputs, and by the way, the whole notion of valuing inputs by their value of their marginal products is exactly true for outputs as well. That the pricing, the efficient pricing of outputs is the what's called the marginal cost, and so the criteria of what's called competitive pricing in neoclassical theory is price equals marginal cost. And so just as the marginal productivity theory tries to say, well, each supplier should get the value of their marginal product, you as if the suppliers were actually producing just a part of the product and they should be get that value. The same metaphor applied to the outputs is the consumers are in fact consuming the inputs, not the product, but the inputs. And so they should pay for the marginal value of the inputs that they consume. And that's why the output should be priced at marginal cost, which is that. So you have this symmetry there. But in any case, you put those together on both sides of the firm, and you have your supply curves and your demand curves in factor markets and in output markets. And that's neoclassical theory. And that's pretty good theory of pricing. I mean, that's different conditions of whether it's competitive or oligopolistic and all that. But that theory is a fine theory. It has nothing to do with the property rights. It's a theory of price well determined at the margin by supply and demand, and so that sort of blew the labor theory of value out of the water correctly, and in any case, the labor theory of value didn't give you a very serious critique of wage labor, only that it was underpaid.
All right.
Not a, and so we should have higher wages and pay the laborers more, and in fact, if you look at the ideal of fully competitive long run equilibrium of neoclassical theory, there were no profits left over. All the this is so-called exhaustion of the product result, that you're at the bottom of the average cost curve and et cetera, and all the revenue is exhausted in the factor payments according to value of marginal product, there's no profit left over. So that's sort of the neoclassical nirvana. And you even have a neoclassical theory of exploitation where factors are paid less than the value of their marginal product, and that holds under certain circumstances where the buyer of the input has some monopolistic power, what's called monopsonistic power, and ends up paying the workers less than the value of their marginal product. So you have the Marxist theory and you have the neoclassical theory of underpaid labor, exploitation in that sense, and neither one gets close to analyzing the what's analyzed by the labor theory of property, the responsibility principle, which has absolutely nothing to do with pricing at all. And so there's a whole, and this is why it's so hard to engage economists on this, because they simply don't have the conceptual apparatus in hand to even talk about the actual property rights, much less the distinction between responsible factors and causally efficacious but non-responsible factors, all the things that get used in production.
Matthew or Gregory, would you care to defend your professions from that assault?
Look, I'm the economist here.
You're a mathematician.
I taught economics for 20 years.
Give these guys a chance.
Painful. I should say one more thing for Brent's interest here. Earlier than Hodgkin and Proudhon and all these, the labor theory of property was applied negatively to the natural resources, and that was the whole movement that ended up with, say, with Henry George, but had a lot of earlier people, Spence and Ogilvy, and basically they said that nobody made the land, and so there was no natural right to people to own land, and even if you had you have the same right to it as anybody else, and that includes future generations. So if you were to say, okay, let's divide up the land evenly right now in ordinary private property rights, and then let the market operate, in other words, privatize all the land, even if you did it very fairly, what would be the problem? Well, the problem would be that disenfranchises all future generations, and because they have, as it were, equal right to natural resources as you do, and so where does one generation get the right to disenfranchise any of the future generations? So that includes, by land, of course, we mean natural resources. That includes oil, natural gas, the whole 9 yards. And so that application of labor theory of property, that sort of negative application, was made much earlier than the positive application to production, to produce products.
Yeah. That's also a fascinating topic, and one we've delved into a little bit. I'd suggest that before we go into that one any deeper, that might be a topic for a whole separate discussion. I'm sure we could easily fill an hour on